As the meta shifts towards a hand trap heavy format, I figured there'd be no better time than now to talk about the most relevant hand traps that you could consider playing in your deck for this post-VALIANT Smashers format. So if you guys enjoy this type of content, let me know by leaving a like, commenting, and subscribing. But with all that being said, let's hop straight into the video. So starting off, just going over the tiers really quickly. Main deck, I think these are cards that you can absolutely make an argument for main decking. If not like 100%, you should be main decking these cards. Strong side deck are cards I think should be in most people's side deck unless you have a very good reason not to. Weak side deck are cards that are perhaps more niche or targeted towards specific matchups and really depend on the meta that you're expecting to play against. And finally, cards that are just not worth it. These are cards that I don't think are super great and shouldn't really be considered. Hopping straight into the tier list, starting off with Ash Blossom, I think it goes without saying, definitely a main deck worthy staple. It's solid into every single matchup in the format right now and can be a blowout in certain matchups as well. Even potentially against a deck like Rescue Ace, being able to stop the Sinful Spoils spell or just being able to stop Emergency can make it so they don't have access to Turbulence very consistently, and then they won't be able to end on anything great. It's a blowout against decks like Branded and Chimera still, and of course it's just very solid into other matchups across the board. Moving on into the next one, Contact C. I think this is an interesting one because it can be annoying against certain decks that sort of like lock you into a single type of summoning, but I think now with the release of SP Little Knight, most if not all decks are going to be playing a counter to this card in the sense that they just have to link any monster plus this into SP Little Knight, and then from there, Contact C just wasn't really that high impact at that point. So for that reason, I think I'm gonna have to put in the not worth tier. Next up is DD Crow. I think DD Crow is a pretty strong side deck card. I wouldn't really consider maining it, but I would say it's a pretty solid side deck choice because it has so much coverage. You can hit decks like Tierlist, to Pearly, and like normally there aren't that many cards that have coverage into different matchups like that. So I think if you need a card that can cover a lot of different matchups, even just like rogue matchups, Crow can be really strong as well. Heck, even against a deck like Unchained, it's not the worst thing in the world because you can hit Shyam out of the graveyard, you can hit Yama out of the graveyard. So I think it's definitely a card you should consider side decking. Next up is Skullmeister. Skullmeister is an interesting one. I don't like this card at all. I don't think it's particularly good aside from against Unchained, but the fact is I think there are just better cards against Unchained out there. Like you can play DD Crow, I think, even, and it'd still be better against Unchained. Just hitting that Shyam out of the graveyard is probably more impactful than a worse Ash in that matchup. And the fact that Skullmeister doesn't really do anything in most other matchups as well, like not even against tier elements because they can always chain block their effects, it's just not that good of a card, and I don't think it's really worth playing unless maybe your deck can search it, for example. Next up is Bystials, specifically Druid Worm. I think Druid Worm is definitely a very strong side deck choice. There's a lot of coverage in this meta. You can use it against Labyrinth, Unchained, Branded. You can use it against tier elements, perhaps most importantly. And the fact that you get an extra body on board is huge because now every deck has access to SP Little Knight, meaning you now have easier access to that card. And that card, as we all know, is pretty insane. So I think for that reason, the Bystials are definitely something you want to consider. Next up is Droll and Lockbird. This one might be a little iffy. I personally am on the boat that Droll is worth main decking, but you can easily make just as valid of an argument for it to be in the side deck. Now, regardless of whether you choose the main deck or not, I feel like it should at least be in your side deck, just because of how many decks in the format actually get crippled by this card. Even a deck like Rescue Ace, which you normally wouldn't think is super great against, I think it's still pretty solid because it can actually cap their ceiling to be pretty manageable. Meaning they're not going to be able to get like the extra draw off of Wanted, for example. If they start with Rhoda or Airlifter, they're not going to be able to access Hydrant effect for the rest of the turn, meaning that turns them off of certain parts of their engine. And I think that being able to cap their ceiling at that is actually pretty strong. And aside from Rescue Ace even, it's still pretty solid into most of the other matchups. It's pretty bad, I guess, into Labyrinth and Unchained, but aside from that, I think it has enough coverage in the meta to warrant main decking if you have the space in your main deck. Next up is Ghost Mourner. I think Ghost Mourner is a very strong side deck option. I personally don't think it's as good as a card of like Valor is, because Valor can hit key normal summons like Neospace Connector and Ganon Ken, whereas Ghost Mourner cannot. And those cards are really big blowouts that you absolutely have to stop, because if you don't, you're probably going to lose if they resolve, meaning you want to have coverage for something like that. Not to mention, Ghost Mourner also is a hard one to return, meaning if you draw multiples, you can't really use it. I will mention though, I would say Ghost Mourner is probably better against a deck like Pearly because they can do stuff in draw phase and standby phase. But aside from that, I think Veiler is just better in almost every situation. And you'd only want to play Mourner if you need extra copies of Imperm or Veiler in your main deck. I will say though, if the meta really shifts towards Rescue Ace and Rescue Ace only, then it could be worth playing the 9 effect negators in your main deck just to, as a counter to specifically the popularity of Rescue Ace. But as it stands right now, the meta is diverse enough to where I think you don't have to only build for Rescue Ace, you have to build for the other meta decks as well. Next up is Ghost Reaper and Winter Cherries. I think this is probably the first card I'll put in weak side deck. It's a very specific and niche card that not every deck can play because extra deck space is pretty valuable nowadays. There are only a select few decks that can actually play this, and even the decks that can play this, like, then you have to consider whether or not you want to play a card like Super Polymerization instead and fill up your extra deck with those slots. So I think Ghost Reaper isn't really going to see much play. You can make an argument that certain decks like Labyrinth technically could play it because they don't need their extra deck. The question then becomes like, what target are you really going to use cherries against? That's going to be super impactful against a lot of these meta decks. Like if you look at a deck like Rescue Ace, it doesn't particularly matter if you cherry something because they can switch up their end board pretty easily. Sure, against Unchained you can hit Yama and that wouldn't be terrible, but it's not like they can't play the game at all. And then similarly with like a lot of these other matchups, like if you hit Vicious Astral out of Manadium, like it sucks, but like it's not completely unplayable at that point. So my point kind of is like it's not really going to ever be high impact enough in most matchups, and there's only going to be very select matchups where it's actually good against. Couple that with the fact that not every deck's going to be able to play it. I just don't think it's really worth putting in your side deck unless your deck can handle it very well and you're making a very specific meta call. Next up is No Material. I think No Material is also like in a similar boat. It's a pretty niche hand trap, and while its effect can be pretty good if you resolve it, the problem now is so many decks can remove bodies off the board without using them for material. So if you think about a deck like Rescue Ace, they have Emergency that can just send it. Bellstar can just send it off the board, so if you stick one of their guys on the board, you can use any of those cards to get rid of it. Unchained can pop any of their own cards, so that doesn't work against them either. Same with Manadium, they can go Visa Starfrost or Obsidian pop their card. And at that point, like, what deck is it really being super effective against? You gotta think about which decks this card would be really impactful against, and usually they're the decks that require you to link up into different monsters. So like if they go to a link one, for example, you hit them with this, it's supposed to be pretty good because your opponent essentially can't link some of the rest of the turn, but you gotta think about how many decks are actually trying to do that. Like you can say Infernoble perhaps, but I believe even if you hit Isolde and stick it in the extra monster zone, it's not impossible for them to either get rid of it or just play as if nothing happened. So for that reason, I'm just almost tempted to put it in not worth it, but I think it's still a card that warrants at least some discussion if you want to consider playing it in your deck. Next up is Imperm. I think it goes without saying, Imperm is definitely a main deck staple. Alongside with Ash Blossom, I think these are the first 6 cards you should be considering to play in your main deck. It's not once return, it's great against a deck like Rescue Ace, good into every other matchup in the format right now. It can be used going second. I think this just has so much going for it that there's no reason to put it anywhere less than the main deck right now. I think Ghost Spell is probably a weak side deck option. I know it has coverage into key matchups like Labyrinth, for example, but aside from that, like there are not that many decks where Ghost Spell is incredibly strong against, where a card like Veiler perhaps can't really do the same thing. Like against a deck like Unchained, like it doesn't really do that much. Against a deck like Rescue Ace, it's not really doing anything. Just a lot of the other matchups in the meta aside from like Labyrinth, Ghost Spell just doesn't do enough in my opinion. I think that it's a pretty solid card if you have a way to search it. Maybe if you're playing like Small World or something, you can play one copy in your deck and you can bridge into it when you need it. But aside from that, I really don't think it has enough coverage to really be a strong side deck option in this format. Lancia, I'm personally in the boat that it's not that good. I'm not really too sure what matchups it could be used against, but I am aware that it does have applications against key decks like Rescue Ace. Like you can say it really caps Rescue Ace in the sense that they're not going to be able to do a lot of their plays without a card like Emergency. So if you're pairing it with like other hand traps as well, I could see it being good. It can potentially shut off Consistency with Prosperity and whatnot. It's good against a deck like Fluanderies, but outside of that, nothing really comes to mind when I think of what Lancia could be good against. So I think it could be a very niche side deck option that really depends on the meta call that you're making. It can be definitely good into certain matchups, but I don't think those matchups include like top meta decks that are the most popular right now. Next up is Nibiru. I think Nibiru is a really strong option in this format. I personally don't actually think it's great against Rescue Ace. Now, the reason I say that is, even if, let's say, they set up their combo and they're going for like Terahertz, yes, you trade with the Terahertz, but at that point, you're never using the Nibiru to really stop Rescue Ace player from setting up their Turbulence in the first place. And not to mention, if their hand is weaker, like, they can still pretty much always summon Turbulence before the 5th summon, meaning a card like Nibiru is just not going to be really good against them, and it's never going to stop their key play of setting 4 from going through. And I think that's a big problem that Nibiru has right now. But outside of that, I think it has pretty solid matchups across the board into decks like Unchained and pretty much every like combo deck out there and every rogue deck out there. So I think I'm gonna have to put it in the strong side deck option. I personally wouldn't main deck it, but that's also completely up to you. You can make the argument for main decking it as well, but in my opinion, at least, I just feel like it's better suited to be in the side deck just because of its lack of coverage against a deck like Rescue Ace and Pearly, which are two of the most popular decks right now. Next up is Ghost Ogre. I think Ghost Ogre has a lot of potential moving forward depending on where the meta goes, and that's because of a deck like Centurion. So Centurion requires a lot of their cards to activate while face up on the field, like all their monsters become trap cards that summon themselves, and their field spell is required for them to do anything on your turn. So I think that if the deck becomes super popular, Ghost Ogre would be a strong side deck choice, but at least at the moment, I think it's a pretty weak side deck choice. It doesn't really do anything to a lot of the other decks aside from Pearly. Like back in the day when Pearly and Super Heavy Samurais were just coming out, like Ogre was pretty insane because it could hit my friend Pearly and that'd be great. But nowadays, like aside from that, it doesn't really do anything else to the top meta decks right now. So unless the meta shifts in the format where Centurion becomes super popular, I don't think Ghost Ogre is going to be a great choice. Next up is Phantasme. I think Phantasme is a pretty solid choice in almost every deck. The extra body, like the Bystials, are pretty strong because of a card like SP Little Knight. So as long as you're able to put a body onto the board that's able to beat over Little Knight, I think that's super critical because now Little Knight Pass isn't going to be as good against you. And Phantasme has the added benefit of being able to be almost like a Little Knight counter. Their Little Knight's just going to be beat over during the next turn. Plus, you have the protection effect that protects against both Little Knight effects. And I think that's super important no matter what deck you're playing. So I definitely say Phantasme is a strong side deck option. A lot of decks link summon nowadays. And even if you're not drawing Handtraps, can still be good. Next up is Retaliating Sea. I'm not really too sure what Retaliating Sea would be used against this format. So I'm going to have to put in the not worth tier. I don't know, aside from Pearly, like what deck you could really side this in against, but if you're siding for Pearly, there are just better cards out there. Like you'd rather play a card like Xyz's Encore or whatever, just so you don't have to rely on hard drawing this card in your opening 5, and you can like draw into Xyz's Encore or something else instead. I just think there are a lot better cards into a deck like Pearly, and you don't really want to be playing Retaliating Sea for that. I could be wrong, there could be other decks out in the format that Retaliating Sea is good against, but I can't really think of them at the moment. So if there are, let me know in the comment section below. Moving on to the next hand trap, it's going to be Gamma. I think Gamma is still a very strong card. I would say if you have the capability of siding it, you probably should. It's very high impact against every meta deck out there, and if you couple it with a card like Cyframe Delta, it can be really strong into a lot of these other decks right now. So against a deck like Pearly, it can stop key Pearly spells. Especially against a deck like Rescue Ace, you can stop the Wanted poster, or you can stop the Sinful Spoils or the Emergency. And I think that's just incredibly strong. I will say though, it's very high risk, high reward. I wouldn't be playing just the one of Gamma unless you're playing a deck like Labyrinth that can get rid of Driver if you hard draw it. But outside of that, I feel like Gamma can be pretty solid. Next up is Effect Veiler. I think Effect Veiler is actually main deckable this format just because of how much coverage it has. It's at least solid into every other matchup right now, and it's pretty good into a deck like Rescue Ace. So I think for that reason, you should be playing Effect Veiler if you have room in your main deck. I think just being able to stop those key normal summons like I mentioned, like Neospace Connector and Jen and Ken, that's going to be incredibly good. If you're able to stop like Turbulence, of course, it's incredibly good. Plus the fact that it's not once per turn means even if you draw multiples, you're still going to be able to use it for something, no matter what matchup it is you're playing against. And finally, Dimension Shifter. I think it goes without saying, if your deck can play it, you're main decking it. I will mention though that there are some decks that can side this that normally wouldn't be main decking such a card, and the general logic with this card is if it hurts my opponent more than it hurts me, then it's going to be worth playing. And I think that that sort of applies for this format as well. If your deck has the capability of siding it, you probably should side it as well, just because of how strong it is against certain other matchups out there. In fact, it pretty much goes well into every matchup that isn't really like Fluonderies or like Labyrinth or something. So I think that Shifter is definitely still a very strong card this format that you should be wary of and should be playing if you have the capability to. So that's going to do it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Let me know what you thought about it in the comment section below. If I missed anything obvious or if you agree, disagree, I will say I tried to make this as concise as possible. So let me know if you guys enjoy more in-depth tier list videos or you prefer me to be as concise as possible in the future. But once again, thanks so much for watching and I'll see you guys in the next one. Take care.